Trump, I mean, like, I find it kind of, strange timing. Maybe not so strange that Trump is making a pretty, significant decision to pull U.S. troops out of Syria. At the same time, he's most likely going to be impeached in the House. So I thought it was like, is this him trying to distract? Whatever the reason is. Obviously, the usual suspects in the military-industrial complex are aghast at him doing this. The discussion is we're basically leaving the Kurds high and dry because they were really on the front lines battling ISIS. That Turkey is going to then go in, which I think they already have. So what's fact versus fiction? Because to me, I'm a little conflicted. I think we should get out of everywhere. But in this one instance, I do think it could rejigger ISIS. But on the other end, I mean, Congress never declared war in Syria, so we're there illegally. So it's kind of like a mute. To me, it's a moot point whether we should get out or not, because we never declared war, or there was no legitimacy to be there in the first place. What's your thoughts?
Well, it's absolutely right that the U.S. has never declared war. This is and has been an illegal war in Syria. The U.S. is waging numerous illegal wars without any authorization. So from a domestic perspective, it's absolutely illegal. From an international perspective, it's also illegal. The U.S. military is occupying foreign soil. The internationally recognized government of Syria has repeatedly said the U.S. military is occupying our territory. And what is that territory? This is not even ever mentioned in these corporate media reports. The U.S. military has constructed more than a dozen bases in northeastern Syria, in the area of the country that just so happens to have the largest oil reserve. Shocker. And also this is important too, just as important as oil, it's also the breadbasket region of Syria. It's where a large percentage of the food is grown, a lot of wheat and other products, and the U.S. is essentially holding this area hostage. I did a report at the Gray Zone looking at a neoconservative Democratic Party aligned think tank in Washington, D.C., and this former Pentagon apparatchik, Nicholas Harris, who wrote this article at the think tank that was later reported on by major news outlets, including AFP, in which he proposed and really openly kind of indicated that the U.S. government policy has been using the wheat supply in Syria in the northeast and holding it hostage as a weapon against the central government of Syria. So basically starving civilians.
Wait, I just want to interrupt you because I thought we are aghast that we have to supply food and services for those starving, struggling people of Venezuela.
Exactly.
You mean we're starving people in Syria?
Well, it's the same exact thing in both. In fact, the U.S. is also starving people in Venezuela, which we can talk about later.
And Yemen.
Yeah, I mean, it's intentionally using siege as a warfare strategy. This is medieval war. It's the same thing in Syria, where this U.S. government-funded think tank in D.C. published this paper saying basically that the U.S. is holding the wheat hostage in this area that the U.S. military controls, preventing the Syrian government from buying the wheat, even though the Syrian government is offering a better price because it subsidizes the wheat to give to its people. So anyway, the point is that there's no discussion of what the U.S. has been doing in this region, or the fact that, again, to stress this point, there are more than a dozen U.S. military bases in northeast Syria. Why do we already have 800 U.S. military bases around the world. Why do we need more? Of course, the excuse they use is defeating ISIS. ISIS is defeated. Now the excuse they're using to say is, we have to stay in northeast Syria because if we leave, ISIS is going to come back, right? So this is always the excuse that's going to be used. What I will say is anyone who opposes war, anyone who's progressive, should support the policy of the U.S. withdrawing troops, not just from Syria, but from Iraq, because there are still troops in Iraq, from Afghanistan, from not the whole region, really. I mean, not just Syria. The thing is, though, and I don't blame you at all for saying that Trump said he's going to withdraw troops. That's actually not what he said. But every media outlet is misreporting what Trump is doing. Trump is not taking troops out of Syria. He's moving the troops. Mm-hmm. This is an important distinction. And you said that correctly, that he's moving them. But the New York Times, CNN, all these people keep saying that he's withdrawing troops. He's not withdrawing troops. There are, right now, around 2,000 U.S. troops in Syria. What Trump is doing is he's moving them from a particular buffer zone that was created to another part of Syria. They're still in Syria, to let Turkey invade. Now that is a huge scandal, and he should be condemned for that. He's green-lighting a Turkish invasion of Syria. Turkey is also illegally occupying Syrian territory, not just the U.S. Turkey, under international law, has no right to be militarily occupying Syrian territory, which it's not just doing in the northeast, it's also doing in other parts of the north. Turkey also, by the way, a major U.S. ally, a member of NATO. Turkey has been supporting ISIS on and off for years. In the early days, Turkey was funneling weapons and support to ISIS. Turkey also had something called the Jihadi Highway. It allowed thousands and thousands of hardline extremists from around the world, from Chechnya and other parts of Russian Federation, from China, from Xinjiang, from Tunisia, from the North Africa, from the other parts of the Middle East. All these jihadis came to Turkey, and Turkey allowed its open border in the south. You know, they had this porous border and allowed thousands of people to cross in to go into Syria to fight with ISIS and all these other groups.
And for those that don't know, what is Turkey's interest in basically toppling Assad and Syria?
Well, Turkey and Syria have been enemies for decades. Mm-hmm. It's geopolitics, right? They're right next to each other. Turkey also, especially in recent years, has an increasingly right-wing Islamist government. Syria has a secular government. Right. They're both police states. Mm-hmm. But what's interesting is that, you know, Syria, of course it's a police state, and the corporate media outlets always say that, but they never say that Turkey, a major U.S. ally, is in many ways even more authoritarian. For instance, Turkey, again, a member of NATO, Turkey imprisons more journalists than any other country in the world. Turkey has more journalists in prison than China, and China is the biggest country in the world. And we always hear about, oh, China's a horrible police state. Meanwhile, our own ally, a member of NATO, which is significantly smaller, still has a larger number of journalists in prison.
And why would Trump all of a sudden move troops to this other area, which he knows that Turkey's going to invade? He did speak with Erdogan.
Yeah.
Right before making this announcement. So what is Trump's, other than just, distracting from the impeachment stuff going on, what's his motivation to do this?
Well, I think a lot of things. I do think you're right that he's trying to distract people, absolutely, from this Ukraine Gate scandal, which we'll talk about. And before we talk about that, I'll say that he did actually engage in a serious crime, and it is actual corruption, although the Bidens are also extremely corrupt too, and we'll talk about there's so much corruption on all sides. So I think that's one issue. But I think also what's happening is, one, Trump doesn't know anything about the region, and he doesn't care. I mean, this guy does not care about anyone, and he's a complete narcissist. He didn't know the difference between the Quds Force and the Kurds, so he clearly doesn't know who the Kurds are, who these U.S.-backed forces are, and he just wants to get out of the region. Now, actually, I think the impulse that, as bad as Trump is, his impulse to want to leave the region is a good thing. I think absolutely we should get out of the region. But again, what he's not actually doing is withdrawing from the region. And I had this up on my phone. I'll read it really quickly. Here's the New York Times. What's interesting is that the headlines always say withdraw, and then no one actually reads the fine details of the story. This is directly from the New York Times report, saying that U.S. military officials, of course, they're always anonymous officials. They're just basically the mouthpiece of the deep state. And the deep state does exist. The New York Times was reporting, U.S. military officials indicated that the 100 to 150 U.S. military personnel deployed to the area, this is the buffer zone with Turkey, would be pulled back in advance of any Turkish operation, but that they would not be completely withdrawn from Syria. That's a very important qualifier. And then they also said that there are at least 1,000, probably up to 2,000 troops that are still in Syria, and all they're doing is, quote, getting out of the way. They're not leaving, they're getting out of the way. So what's happening is that Trump and Erdogan agreed to give the green light for a Turkish invasion. Now, why is Turkey doing this? Turkey is fighting Kurdish forces in the region. Turkey is an extremely racist state that has been repressing the Kurdish minority for well over 100 years. And, of course, Turkey committed the Armenian genocide, and not just against Armenians, but also against Orthodox, Assyrians, other Christians. So Turkey, for a variety of political reasons, has been waging a war internally and externally against Kurdish militant groups, some of which are separatists and have been trying to create a Kurdistan. Now, elements of the U.S. government also want to create an independent Kurdistan because they want to balkanize the region.
Mm-hmm.
They want to divide the region up and have inter-ethnic fighting so they can better dominate it, right? Because if you have people fighting among themselves, you can control them better.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why the Pentagon, the CIA, elements of the U.S. government have been supporting some of these Kurdish independence groups. It's not because they care about the Kurds, and they're pretending they're saying Trump is abandoning the Kurds. They don't care about the Kurds either. They want to use the Kurds to balkanize and divide up the region. And you can look back to the Iraq War. During the Iraq War, before, leading up to, and during the Iraq War, there were all these maps that were drafted. And you can see these neoconservative groups in the Bush administration wanted to divide Iraq up. And they wanted the Kurdish region, which would be a separate region. They wanted a Shia region and a Sunni region. And they wanted to do the same thing to Syria. They wanted to divide this country up on ethnic and religious sectarian lines so they can better control it, so that it can exploit it. And especially, to stress this point, the Kurdish majority region in Syria, again, has the largest oil reserves in Syria.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a coincidence that the U.S. military is there. And the Syrian government has been trying to get access to that oil and open specifically a road to Baghdad, to Iraq, and hasn't been able to.
So basically, the Syrian government has been trying to get access to its own oil.
And its own wheat, and its own roads, its own highways.
That are being blocked off by the U.S., who is there illegally.
Yes, the U.S. is there illegally under international law, but some Kurdish forces, not all of them, people always talk about the Kurds as if they're one group, but some Kurdish leaders have allowed the U.S. to occupy this region because it's true that the U.S. did help them fight ISIS.
Mm-hmm.
And it's true that the Kurds played a major role in fighting ISIS, and they should be credited for that, absolutely. Mm-hmm. I mean, ISIS committed genocide in this region. And so it's in a situation, though, where the U.S. military is illegally occupying this land. The U.S. has to leave at some point, and we should encourage that. The only solution for the Kurdish leadership, which some people in the Kurdish leadership want to do, is to make an agreement with the Syrian government so the Syrian army can redeploy to the northeast and prevent Turkey from invading. But the U.S. doesn't want that either. So that's why the U.S. isn't withdrawing. The U.S. is moving and still preventing the Syrian army from retaking its own territory and allowing Turkey instead to invade. And Turkey is going to commit horrible war crimes. Turkey's going to ethnically cleanse the region. And Turkey's strategy, because again, Turkey's been waging a war against the Kurdish population in this region, not just in its own borders, but within that region. Turkey wants to ethnically cleanse the Kurdish population and then take its own refugee population from inside, Syrian refugees from inside Turkey, and replace the Kurdish areas with those Syrian refugees, permanently changing the demography of this region. Mm-hmm. So this is just classic colonial style ethnic cleansing. It's the kind of thing that the British and French colonialists did, where they would population transfer. They would move one population here to there to better control the population. It's similar to what they did with the Tutsis in Rwanda, which led to the Rwandan genocide, where they think they can just move entire populations around because they can make buffers. Mm-hmm. So the idea is Turkey has 3.6 million Syrian refugees that it took. Turkey helped destabilize and destroy Syria, and so many people fled to Turkey, mostly Sunni Arabs, Syrian Sunni Arabs. So Turkey is going to take those refugees and basically just put them in this border region inside Syria that used to be inhabited by Kurds, to try to push the Kurds out and then make a buffer zone of people who will be supportive of Turkey. And then Turkey will just treat this as a kind of annexed territory. Turkey already has done that. Turkey has done that in an area called Afrin, which used to be a Kurdish majority town. And this was an area also where ISIS was fighting the Kurds. And Turkey was supporting ISIS, the enemy of the enemy is my friend, was supporting ISIS against the Kurds there in Afrin. And then after Turkey invaded, and so the Kurds defeated ISIS. And then after the Kurds defeated ISIS, Turkey invaded and took over Afrin inside Syria, pushing out, ethnically cleansing the Kurds, and then replacing the community with Syrian refugees. And then in the schools, people are learning Turkish. This is inside Syrian territory. They're Arabs, but they're learning Turkish. And if you look at these insane videos released by Turkish state media, the children are all chanting, "Thank you, Erdogan. Thank you, Shukran Erdogan." And on the walls, there's giant posters of Erdogan.
Wow.
So what the U.S. is doing is, the U.S., from the perspective of the U.S., they don't want Syria to retake its own Syrian territory because Syria is an enemy and because Turkey's an ally. So they'd rather have Turkey just ethnically cleanse the region, because then they know that this region is still going to be sympathetic to the U.S.
Right.
So the thing is, we should support the U.S. withdrawing troops, but that's not really what Trump's doing. He's just moving them.
Right.
And like, the idea that Trump is an idiot. The thing is, Trump says he wants to withdraw troops. He says that he wants to end these wars, but he's also an idiot who doesn't know what he's doing, and he's just telling the military, move these troops, and they're doing what they want to do, which is not withdrawing them completely.
Hope you enjoyed that last video. Hop on over to statuscoup.com, where you can sign up for our email list and become a member for as low as $5 to $10 a month. Membership is how we grow. That's statuscoup.com/join. And remember, join our email list so we can grow the revolution with you.